morning again to everyone. Morning and so on. So we can continue. So this talk is going to be quite different from the previous one in the following respect. It's still focusing, of course, on the Middle East, but if our first talk was attempting at least to drill down and get to a very sort of granular, very high resolution, so to speak, look at a very specific issue, namely that of the attitudes towards the Jews of the Lebanese Shia Hizballah movement. What I want to try and do in this talk is a little bit to take a view from 30,000 feet in the air, so to speak, of the Middle East region as a whole, and to try to tease out what seemed to me at least to be the main trend lines in the region and the main players and groups of players. And what I'll try and do also is I'll try and do that in not too long a time of talking at you, so that we then have enough time at the end both for questions and for conversation. This is the only other session that I'm doing in this conference, so I'm not really going to have any kind of classroom type session, so I do want to use this session also to allow for me to get to know some of you, so to speak, and for us to have an interesting exchange of perspectives and knowledge. With regard then to the trend lines and strategic directions in the Middle East, it is my contention, at least, that we are in the Middle East today probably at the end of a period of very great historic unrest and instability. Now that doesn't mean, of course, you'll be happy to hear, or you'll be relieved to hear, it doesn't mean that we're entering now a period of stability and good governance in the region. That'd be great. I'm afraid we're still nowhere near any of that. But it does mean that we are at the end of a notable and identifiable moment, it would seem to me, of change led from below. And I'm talking, of course, about the period of unrest that commenced in late 2010 in Tunisia, with the demonstrations there which successfully brought down the long-standing authoritarian regime of bin Ali, which then spread to Egypt and brought down Mubarak, which spread thence to Syria in early 2011, of course to Yemen, to Libya, and elsewhere. The combination of revolutions, counter-revolutions, civil wars, elections, collectively, initially misnamed the Arab Spring. Nobody uses that term anymore, but everyone knows what we're talking about. Now, my suggestion is that this period this wave of change has now largely spent itself. Now, that's not completely true. We can think of examples in the region, or at least in the outlying parts of the region, where there are still movements from below pushing for change, and there would be two obvious examples. One would be Sudan, and the other would be Algeria. But certainly in what one might call the kind of heartland of the Arabic-speaking Middle East, in the Gulf and in the Levant, this is a wave that has largely run its course. Now, history is familiar with similar examples. If we think of the wave of uprisings that hit authoritarian and conservative Europe in 1848, which spread from country after country and then spent itself. And we know from that historical example, it doesn't mean that change from below is then done with forever. These things come in waves. Yeah, and we know that this was 1848, and then just in 1870 there was the Paris Commune. So we know that it hadn't spent itself in Europe, and probably this impulse has not spent itself in the Middle East either. But this particular wave appears to have largely spent itself. Which means that in looking at our region today, we ask ourselves the question, what has changed as a result of the very dramatic events of the last decade? What does the region look like as the wave passes? Is there some commonality that we can, or some commonalities that we can tease out? And in this respect, I would suggest that there are, and that what we have witnessed, first of all, what we have not witnessed, alas, once again to note, is the birth of more representative governance in the region. That largely has not taken place. There's one exception to that, of course, which is Tunisia. But with the exception of Tunisia, more representative governance remains elusive in the region. But there is nevertheless, I think, some commonalities to be drawn from country to country, and they are the following. or the most notable of them, I think, is the following. What we've witnessed is the effective collapse and fragmentation of a whole number of Arabic-speaking states of relatively long historic standing that today no longer exist in the sense that they are performing the full set of functions that we would normally expect of a state. Among the collapsed and fragmented states that we should note, I would suggest, are the following. On the outlying parts of the region, Libya and Yemen, and in the central heart of the Arabic-speaking Middle East, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Now, what that means in terms of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon is that a whole geographically important and culturally significant swathe at the heart of the Arabic-speaking world is today in a situation in which there is no single fully functioning state. Not only is this geographically and culturally important area, it's important in the sense that it's also territorially contiguous. Between the Iraq-Iran border, that is to say, and the Mediterranean Sea today, there is no single fully functioning state. There are three nominal states, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. None of them are performing the full functions expected of a state. And what we rather witness in that space, and also in Yemen, and also in Libya, is a kind of war of succession, or to put it more poetically, a kind of war among the ruins, so to speak, which is being fought out for the most part by political/military organizations, that's to say organizations that can combine political and military activity under one roof or in one framework, and many of these organizations are organized on religious, sectarian, or ethnic, or sometimes tribal basis. Now, that's a big heading, but that applies in its various ways across the swathe of territory that I'm discussing. So this is the point number one: war over the ruins being fought out by political military organizations against one another, fighting for the succession of power in these collapsed spaces. The second point to note is that while a number of central states in the region may have collapsed and fragmented, that doesn't mean to say that there are no powerful state actors left in the region. On the contrary, there are still very powerful states and very powerful groups of states. So to understand the dynamic in the region, what we need to do, I would suggest, is to look at which are the states that are powerful, with whom are they aligned, who's doing well, who's doing badly, and if we can answer those questions, we can begin to start to understand the main strategic dynamics taking place in our Middle East region. I'd like then to go on to look now at a number of different at the main state-led formations in our region, at their components and at their specific natures, and then we can go on to look a little bit at the role of global players in this picture, specifically the United States of America and Russia, before moving to conclusion. Now, I want to look at 3 or maybe 4, depending on how you define it. I'll get on to this question of 3 or 4 in a moment. 3 or 4 main regional blocks/trends in our region. The controversy as to whether there is 3 or 4, I'll get on to at the end. The first 2, which I want to talk about, are very clearly and easily defined. The first regional bloc or alliance which I want to talk about takes us a little bit back to our discussion or my lecture this morning regarding Lebanese Hizballah, because the first alliance I want to talk about is the regional bloc led by the Islamic Republic of Iran, which includes Iran itself, of course, Lebanese Hizballah, which, as I tried to outline today, effectively dominates Hizballah, the Assad regime in Syria, the Houthi or Ansar Allah movement in Yemen, the Islamic Jihad organization among the Palestinians, and the very powerful 150,000 strong coalition of Shia militias in Iraq. Those are the main components of Iran-led regional alliance. Now, my suggestion, and not only mine, would be that this Iran-led regional alliance is by far the most powerful and cohesive or powerfully cohesive, is a good way of putting it, of all the regional alliances we're going to go on to look at. It doesn't mean that the Iranians are strong in every way. It doesn't mean that they're better at everything than everybody else. They have very notable weaknesses, which we can go on to look at and discuss. But nevertheless, they have certain strengths that have enabled them to do very well in the context of the fragmented and collapsed region of the last 10 years. So I want to go on to look at what is it that's leading them to do so well. I would suggest that the answer to this is to be found, to be located in the self-definition of Iran, of Islamic Republic of Iran, as a revolutionary state. Obviously, as everybody knows, the current Iranian government came into power as a result of Islamic Revolution of 1979, and it considers itself still to be a revolutionary state. Now here's the thing, this claim of revolutionary status is not simply a conceit on the part of the Iranians. It's not just a piece of rhetoric. It has organizational form. What I mean is that as a result of its claim to revolutionary status, Iran possesses certain organizations and agencies which are extremely and uniquely useful, which have proven extremely and uniquely useful to Iran in the context of the kind of region with which we are currently faced. Specifically in the form of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, IRGC, which I hope everybody is, the name of which I hope is familiar to everybody here, and specifically in the organizational person, so to speak, of the Quds Force, the expeditionary force of IRGC. Iran has a group of people whose specific task, is the creation and raising up and support of proxy forces in neighboring states that they might serve the interests of, well, depending on who you ask. If you ask the Iranians themselves, they serve the interests of the global Islamic revolution. Or if you want to put it in more prosaic terms, they serve the interests of the Islamic Republic of Iran, that's to say the Iranian state. This is a group of people whose specific job is the creation and support of such organizations. This is not an intelligence agency, though it can function as an intelligence agency if required. It's not a military organization, though it can also provide military training and supervision if required. What it is it is a gathering of people whose specific career task, so to speak, is the fomenting of Islamic revolution in neighboring countries. A very curious type of organization then. Not the kind of organization that normal states possess, including states much more powerful than Iran. Israel has no such organization. The United States of America has no such organization. The UK has no such organization. If we want to try to locate some historical parallels to this gathering of people, we would have to look to other self-proclaimed revolutionary states that are known to history, so to speak. And if we think of the Soviet Union, of Soviet Russia, we can maybe draw some parallels. Back in the days when people still believed in communism fervently in the 20s and 30s, the Communist International, the Comintern, played a very important role on behalf of Soviet foreign policy. Now, those of us there are a few people left today who remember the 1930s, but there's still quite a few of us left who remember the 1970s and 1980s. And it's for that reason that we often tend to sort of belittle or poo-poo the notion of such organizations, because we remember the Soviet Union in its final kind of geriatric stage, when it still proclaimed itself to be the homeland of global revolution, but nobody else took it particularly seriously. And that also had organizational form. There was a thing called the Cominform, if some people here remember, which claimed to be this center of global revolutionary sentiment operated by and on behalf of the Soviet government. And everybody realized it was a ridiculous joke. Nobody wanted to have their economy modeled on the Soviet model by the mid-1980s, so nobody took it very seriously. But the thing is that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not at that stage in its revolutionary trajectory. It's not in its dotage, so to speak. It's still in its prime. And the Quds Force and Revolutionary Guards Corps do have a model which is attractive to certain forces operating in the region. Now here's the interesting thing. This is about the way in which the historical key meets the lock, so to speak. When you have regional stability, when states are strong and they have strong state agencies available in their defense, organizations like the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps don't tend to get very far. And we can think of examples when the IRGC tries to agitate amongst the Shia of eastern Saudi Arabia, or when they try to organize in Bahrain or in Kuwait, which are relatively strong states with relatively strong security agencies, then they don't get very far. The security agencies pick them up and ship them off home very quickly. But in a situation like the one I was describing a few minutes ago, in which state authority has collapsed and fragmented all the way across the region, and in which a war of succession is in any case taking place, being fought out by political military organizations, often organized on sectarian or ethnic or tribal basis, then the possession by an organization, by a state, of an organization whose specific skill set is the raising up of proxy political and military organizations will be worth its weight in gold to the state that possesses such a body. Iran possesses such a body, no other regional state does, and as a result, Iran is doing extremely well, has been doing extremely well in these fragmented spaces across the region. Now, rather than just sort of throw that thought out there, let's take a specific and practical example to see how this stuff actually works. As I mentioned, the Assad regime in Syria is a key component part of Iran-led regional bloc. Everybody here knows that in 2011-2012, the Assad regime in Syria got itself into very serious trouble indeed. Yeah? It was facing an insurgency, and it had difficulty in responding to that insurgency. And there was a specific structural difficulty at the root of the Assad regime, which made it very hard for Assad to respond to the insurgency raised against him, namely the very narrow sectarian basis of his regime, the very narrow basis of sectarian support that his regime had. Why? Assad family come from a group called the Alawis. It's a particular ethno-sectarian, ethno-religious group in the Levant. They are around 12% of the population of Syria, and they form the hardcore of support for Assad. Now, Assad got into trouble, and what he needed was manpower. He needed plenty of people willing to take a bullet for him. But because of the narrow basis of support for his regime, he didn't have such a pool of manpower available to him. Now, the insurgency in Syria was based on the Sunni Arab majority in the country. So around 60% of Syrians are Sunni Arabs. They had plenty of people. Assad didn't have enough people. And that, in 2011-2012, looked like it might end up costing him his regime, and probably it would have cost him his life as well, the Middle East being what it is. Now, what happened at that point was that Islamic Republic of Iran, but specifically organizationally, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, were ordered by Iran government to mobilize proxy organizations and fighters from all the way across the region and beyond the region, from Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as Iraq and Lebanon, to mobilize these fighters from all the way across the world, so to speak, and recruit them and arm them and bring them to Syria and deploy them in such a way as to serve a friend in need, in this case, Bashar al-Assad. And that was achieved. And it was these thousands of fighters, the Fatimiyun from Afghanistan, the Zainabiyun from Pakistan, and so on and so forth, the Shia militias from Iraq, Lebanese Hizballah, once again, from Lebanon. It was these fighters whose entry into Syria in 2012 and 2013 saved the day for Bashar al-Assad, formed that key block that he needed of manpower against the Sunni Arab insurgents. Now, this was an astonishing achievement by the Iranians. Not only astonishing in a logistical way, which, by the way, you can think of it in that way as well, even to logistically be able to mobilize thousands of fighters, feed them, clothe them, arm them, and bring them across the world in some cases to Syria and put them in the right place is an impressive achievement. Not only logistically, but also politically. To have such a pool of people available and willing to take a bullet and to fight on the front line in their thousands is a very impressive achievement indeed. And we know it's impressive, even though the Iranians kind of made it look easy. We know it's impressive because we have a counterexample from the same period of how not to do it. Right? Because at the same time that the Iranians were mobilizing people from all across the world in a centralized, organized, effective way and putting them in the battlefields of Syria, on the other side of the line in Syria, for the Sunni Arab insurgency, Sunni Arab states were trying their best to themselves organize their support for the rebels to defeat Assad and were making an absolute unholy mess of the thing. Yeah? A disorganized, chaotic, appalling mess of the thing. And I know that because as a journalist, I was in northern Syria and southern Turkey on the rebel side for a considerable period of time in that moment. And I witnessed close up from the rebel side the absolute appalling chaos that took place as the Saudis and Qataris and Turks and Muslim brothers all tried hard to pick their own favorite rebel unit and make sure that weaponry and money got to them. And what you had emerge was a kind of free market of the very worst kind, by the way. I respect the free market in most contexts, not in this one. A kind of free market of support in which rebel militias, sometimes very small ones, would produce kind of YouTube videos of themselves and then go up to southern Turkey and market themselves to the representatives of various regional states who were there with, fistfuls of dollars to give to the supposedly deserving militia to fight against Assad. Exactly the way not to do it. It was an appalling mess. And of course, the rebels went on to basically lose the war, as we're now witnessing. So the Iranians showed, one, how to do it, and secondly, we see that's not an easy thing to do at all. To conclude with regard to the Iran-led regional bloc, again, it doesn't mean that they're unstoppable, it doesn't mean that they're invulnerable, it doesn't mean that they're good at everything. They're good at one very specific thing. But that very specific thing, the raising up of proxies, has been of acute relevance, so to speak, extreme relevance in the Middle East in recent years. How do we know that they're not good at everything? Because we have always also practical examples of recent years of what happens with regard to the Iranians and their friends if you can change the subject of the conversation, so to speak, from stuff that they're good at to stuff that they're maybe less good at. They're very good at proxy warfare, as I hope we have already established. But if, for example, you can change the subject of the conversation to intelligence and air warfare, then they are left rather weak and rather helpless because they're not very good at that stuff at all. And we know that because there's one state, which is the state of Israel, which has been doing that precisely over the skies of Syria for the last 3 years, conducting a long series of pinpointed air raids, over 200 pinpointed air raids against Iranian targets inside Syria. And the Iranians have been left fairly helpless at that. They don't have an air force, so to speak. They don't have air defenses. They can't defend themselves against that stuff. They're very good at certain things, much weaker at other areas of activity. Thus far then, with regard to the Iran-led regional bloc, what of the other blocs active in this confused and confusing Middle East space? Well, there are some analysts, usually people more optimistic than I in their nature, who like to say in discussing these issues that, well, yes, there's the Iran-led regional bloc, but then there is also a counter-bloc. There is a counter-alliance of countries and movements who similarly are concerned at the advance of the Iranians and maybe are also similarly concerned about the advance and rise of Sunni political Islam. And so these countries and movements are working together in order to form a kind of counter-alliance which is challenging the advance of the Iranians. And the candidates for membership, if I can put it that way, of this counter-alliance of moderate states or conservative states, that is sometimes referred to, usually include the following countries. Well, first of all, the State of Israel itself. Sisi's Egypt is usually included in the list. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, probably Kuwait, probably even the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah of Mahmoud Abbas, and probably also the Kurdish regional government of the Barzanis in northern Iraq. That's kind of the list of countries that are usually held to belong to this moderate or conservative bloc. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Middle East can already tell what the problem is with this bloc, right? Certainly if you compare it to Iran-led regional bloc. The problem is that it includes a long and extremely disparate list of countries who are extremely different in terms of their actual ideology and belief systems, and who often don't agree about specific regional files, which means that a more modest, if more long-winded, so to speak, way of describing this group of countries would probably be to say this is a group of countries and movements that sometimes agree with each other and sometimes don't, and when they agree with each other they can work together very well, and when they don't agree with each other they can't work together at all. That's a very different type of entity, so to speak, to the tightly controlled and cohesive and centralized Iran-led regional bloc. But I think that's a more accurate description of this conservative so-called alliance. Let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate this point. When two members of this alliance agree about something, they can work very, very effectively together. For example, Israel and Egypt share deep concern at the issue of the Islamic State franchise operating in northern Sinai, a very dangerous group of people, of armed people, called Wilaya al-Sina, or the Sinai province of Islamic State. They used to be called Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, which is an interesting name itself, which we don't have time to go into. But now they're called the Sinai province of Islamic State. They're dangerous to Egypt, they're dangerous to Israel. It's a clearly identifiable danger. And as a result, Israel and Egypt currently work together on a level of security cooperation with regard to fighting Islamic State in northern Sinai on a higher level than has existed at any time since the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement of 1979. Because you have a close and obvious common interest, so the sides can work together. So far, so good. That's the good news, so to speak. But if we take a counter-example, we see where the problems are in identifying this supposed conservative or moderate regional alliance. Take the example of the Syrian war. Now, when Sisi's Egypt looks at the Syrian civil war, what do they see? What they see is an authoritarian military-style government, that of Bashar al-Assad, not all that different to themselves, facing a largely Sunni Islamist insurgency, not all that different to the Muslim Brotherhood insurgency that they regard themselves as facing inside Egypt. So who does the Sisi government naturally support in the Syrian context? It supports the Assad regime. Yeah? Now, if Saudi Arabia looks at the situation in Syria, who does Saudi Arabia naturally support? Or what does Saudi Arabia see? Saudi Arabia sees an Iran-supported regime, the Assad regime, and Iran is Saudi Arabia's main enemy, an Iran-supported regime fighting against a popular Sunni Arab Muslim insurgency. So who do the Saudis naturally support in such a context? They support the insurgency. Both views have their own internal logic. The problem is what you have here as a result is two members of this supposedly moderate or conservative alliance actually supporting opposite sides in one of the most important regional files of them all. Now, that's not the end of the world. Nobody's committing a crime, so to speak, or maybe some of the sides are committing crimes against humanity, but that's another discussion. But the point is that you couldn't imagine this happening on the Iranian side. Iranian-led clients and allies do not support opposite sides in important regional files. They act as one hand, so to speak. But the Saudi Egyptians and the supposed moderate alliance do not. And this is a deep weakness and problem with regard to that alliance. Now, if we turn to the third and fourth members, or third and fourth entities or blocks that we want to talk about, I said there was a problem in defining whether there was 3 or 4. And I want to go on to explain this problem. Had we been having this discussion in 2012, we would now spend a very large amount of time talking about a rising regional bloc, which we would probably have defined as the bloc of conservative Sunni political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood type Islamism. And we would have included in the list of people that we need to talk about the government in Egypt, i.e. the government of President Mohamed Morsi in Egypt, the government in Tunisia, which replaced Ben Ali, which was a Muslim Brotherhood type government, the Emirate of Qatar, Erdogan's government in Turkey, the Hamas-led enclave in Gaza, and we probably have said pretty soon these guys are going to be in Damascus too when they drive out the weakening and crumbling Assad regime. But that, of course, was 2012. 7 years on from that, we note there's very little remaining, actually, of that supposed Muslim Brotherhood type bloc, which looked so new and strong and young just 7 years ago. Mohamed Morsi is out of power in Egypt. Of course, he actually died a few weeks ago, and the Muslim Brothers are back in jail in Egypt. In Tunisia, they're back in opposition. In Syria, the rebellion is largely spent and Assad is victorious. So what's left is Hamas down in Gaza, the Turkish government, of course, and the Emirate of Qatar as the kind of lead financier or cheerleader of this outlook. Now, that's a much smaller group of forces. I want to add a caution here and say, don't be too quick to think that the Muslim Brotherhood are gone forever. They've been around since 1928, and they had their moment in the sun in 2012, and it turned out to be a much briefer trajectory than many of us had thought. But it doesn't mean that the Muslim Brotherhood is gone forever for the following reason. One, organizationally, they're still out there. But secondly, and this is the most important point, the big losers in country after country and context after context in the Middle East over the last decade have been the Sunni Arab populations, whether you look in Iraq or among the Palestinians or in Syria or in Lebanon or in Yemen or elsewhere. It's the Sunni Arab Muslims that have been the losers. But the fact that they've lost doesn't mean that they've disappeared. It does mean there's a very large population of very angry young Sunni Arab Muslims who are going to be looking for political and military representation in the period opening up now in the region. And it is likely that some of them will find their way back to conservative Sunni political Islam. Now, the fourth group, which one would sometimes characterize at this point is the group of very extreme Sunni political Islam, the Salafi Jihadi groups. Yeah? Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and networks of that kind. Once again, these are not states, but they are powerful trans-border networks with a clear ideology, with plenty of guns, with plenty of money, and they're very active also in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. Now, the dilemma or the discussion with regard to whether we can talk about 3 or 4 regional blocs comes with this question: whether we should consider conservative Sunni political Islamic bloc and the Salafi Jihadis as one bloc or 2. There are different ways of looking at this, and I don't want to draw a final sort of conclusion because there isn't one conclusion, but the issue would be the following. On the one hand, you can say there are quite identifiably separate ideologies in this part. The Salafi Jihadis want to rush on to creating an Islamic caliphate across the globe, and they want to do that by military and paramilitary and terrorist means as soon as possible in the immediate future. In the case of Islamic State, they even wanted to declare the caliphate, and declared the caliphate, obviously, in June 2014 in the Al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul in Iraq. And by comparison, the Muslim Brotherhood type organizations operate through politics, usually in not an armed context. And they operate through mass movement, and they operate much more slowly. So from this point of view, maybe you can say this is one block and this is another block. But if you try to draw the organizational links between these various states and movements, you rapidly will discover that they tend to work together, often in a clandestine or semi-clandestine way, but you can trace the links if you look close enough. For example, Jabhat al-Nusra, I'm not sure if the name is familiar to people here, I hope it is, which is Salvation Front, which is a very powerful Sunni Arab insurgent movement in Syria, is a Salafi Jihadi movement par excellence. It was connected to Al-Qaeda, it has the Salafi Jihadi outlook. But if you look at who's been working with Jabhat al-Nusra in northern Syria over the last 7 years, you will very rapidly find the fingerprints, so to speak, of both Turkey and Qatar. So another way of looking at this would be to say, well, often the Salafi Jihadis, because they tend to be crazy and enthusiastic about fighting and getting martyred and the rest of it, often turn out to be the kind of attack squads, so to speak, of the broader Sunni Islamist interest. I tend to find that view more persuasive, so I tend to think of there being 3 blocks rather than 4. But I would accept certainly that one can make a case for a distinction, certainly on an intellectual or ideological level, between these different Islamist trends, so to speak. Thus far then, with regard to regional alliances, I said that I'd also look briefly, before moving on to our discussion and conversation, about the roles of Russia and the United States. So let me briefly look at Russia first of all. Look, the Russians were out of our neighborhood for a long time, right? Again, those of us who are old, actually, for this you'll need to be older than me because I don't remember 1973 in real time, I'm happy to point out, but I'm sure that there are perhaps some here that do. Those of us who remember the 1973 war will remember a time, of course, when the Soviet Union was a vital and central player in the Middle East, sponsoring and supporting particular powerful regional states and opposing others. That time ended a long time ago. It ended, by the way, considerably before the final collapse of communism between 1980, or Soviet communism, between 1989 and 1991. The Soviets were effectively out of our region by the end of the 1970s, to all intents and purposes. The big point was the decision of the Egyptians under Sadat to go from the Soviet umbrella towards the American umbrella, so to speak, and that kind of pushed the Russians out. Here's the thing, the Russians are now back for the first time in 40 years, and they're back as a result of the Syrian civil war and as a result of their very effective intervention into the Syrian civil war starting in late 2015, starting in September 2015. The Russian air intervention, the presence of Russian air power appearing over the skies of Syria on September 30th, 2015 was the thing, more than any other factor, which finally turned the war in Bashar Assad's favor. That's the bad news, so to speak, from the point of view of those of us in Israel who understand Russia to be a rival, not necessarily an enemy, but a rival country. The good news, partial good news at least, we tend to look for good news where we can find it, so to speak, is that the Russians very clearly have not come into the region in order to become strategic allies of the Iran-led regional bloc. It's not as simple as that. The Russians were fighting with Iran, of course, on behalf of Bashar Assad in Syria. It doesn't mean to say they're adopting wholesale the Iranian interest across the region. On the contrary, the Russians, surprise, surprise, are in it for the Russians, which means that when it comes to Syria, they'll work with the Iranians to keep their 2 naval bases in Tartus and Latakia and the big air base in Khmeimim and Bashar Assad safe in his presidential palace in Damascus. But beyond the issue of Syria, often the Russians have counter-interests to those of the Iranians. The Russians want to sell arms, and they want to sell arms to everybody. They'll sell arms to Iran, but they'll sell arms to Iran's enemies too. They want to sell arms to Egypt. They want to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. Basically to anybody who's got enough money. And by the way, it's kind of an ironic thing. As you know, Israel is engaged in air warfare against the Iranians, and many of the systems that Israel is destroying are actually Russian-made systems that the Iranians bought from the Russians. But when you speak to Russian diplomats in Tel Aviv, as I occasionally have occasion to do, and you bring this matter up, they say, oh, we don't care because the Iranians already paid for that stuff. Yeah? So actually, from my point of view, you can destroy it, then they'll just have to buy more. It's totally fine. The Russians are cynical, and they're in it for their own interest, but they're not in it for Iran's interest. So we find in the Israeli context, for example, that when we find it necessary to take air action against Iran in Syrian soil, the Russians will be happy to, not happy, they will be willing to stand aside, even if they have their own air defense systems inside Syria, and not operate those against Israeli aircraft carrying out those missions. Bottom line with regard to the Russians is the following, at least in my estimation. Putin has performed something very well for his country. What he's done is he's created a situation in which Russia kind of acts as a superpower, as if it was a superpower in certain contexts on the globe. But Russia is not a superpower. Russia does not have the economic muscle which is required to actually be a superpower. What Russia is performing is a kind of facsimile, if that's the correct word, a kind of like imitation to some degree of a superpower, which is good from Putin's point of view, because one, it sells weapons, and secondly, the Russian people, or a large percentage of them at least, seem to expect that their country ought to behave like a superpower. So this builds also Putin's domestic popularity, but it's not really a global power of the kind which we have known in history. Thus far, which means there is a limited set of goals of necessity for the Russians in the Middle East, and they are mainly concerned with areas outside of our region. Thus far with regard to Russia. And finally, with regard to the United States. Well, at this point, I often am tempted to be a little bit sarcastic, and especially because there are many American citizens I know that I'm aware of in the audience. So this one I usually say, well, you should tell me what American interests and strategy is in the region, because I've been doing regional analysis for the last 20 years, but right now I'm stumped. I'm looking for that inner pattern, and I can't quite find it. Yeah? But since I'm not going to be sarcastic, I'll take the point seriously instead, and say the following. There is a certain interesting commonality between the regional strategy of the Obama administration and that of the Trump administration, in spite, of course, of the very, very great difference in rhetoric between the two administrations. And that is that both Obama and Trump, each in their very different ways, were concerned not to get America involved once again in any more costly ground adventures, so to speak, in the region of the kind that the US have been involved in Iraq and in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. And that is quite genuinely, I think, a commonality. The difference is that Obama, and you can support or oppose Obama, of course, but Obama had a very clear, I think, strategy of how he wanted to do that. And the nuclear deal with Iran, JCPOA with Iran, and not getting involved in the Syrian war and so on, were all clearly component parts of that. Obama had the idea of turning the Iranians into a normal regional actor, and then sort of leaving the Middle East to find its own balance between Iranian power, Saudi power, Israeli power, and so on. Now, you can take issue with whether that was achievable or not, but I think it's clear that's what the Obama administration was trying to do, and there was a certain sort of unity in that regard. But with regard to the Trump administration, it's a bit more difficult, because there appear to be kind of two quite contradictory impulses coexisting in the Trump administration. The one of these impulses is a quite hawkish view, which sees the Iranian advance across the region as a real danger, in the way that many regional actors like Israel and Emirates and Saudi Arabia see it too, and therefore wants to invest in trying to stop the Iranian advance and maybe turn the Iranians back. And it's worthwhile noting that at the end of the day, people tend to say, well, the president doesn't think that, but Bolton thinks it, and Pompeo. Yeah, Bolton and Pompeo only have their jobs because President Trump wants them to continue in those jobs, as National Security Advisor and as Secretary of State. So yes, it's quite true that Pompeo and Bolton certainly do regard Iran as a very dangerous force and want to turn it back. They only have their jobs in those jobs because Trump wants them to have those jobs. But nevertheless, it appears that Trump himself kind of has that idea, but he has another impulse as well, which is the impulse absolutely to not get America involved in a new conflict in the region, and especially not a year before election year 2020. The last thing Trump wants to do is to go into the election against a background of a new, costly conflict in the Middle East. So it's not quite clear where that contradictory set of impulses end up taking you, or taking all of us, But these two contradictory impulses can clearly be identified. They're kind of existing in an uncomfortable way, both within the administration, and it would seem to me also, that's above my pay grade to get into this, but it would seem to me also they're coexisting in the president's mind as well. Yeah, he genuinely is committed to both these notions, and they don't always rub along comfortably together. And that, it would seem to me, is where US strategy is currently at. And that's why you can see a situation in which lots of US allies in the region, Israel among them, Saudi Arabia, and others, on the one hand are very pleased at the newly assertive role which the US appears to be taking with regard to the Iranian advance across the region, but are also deeply uneasy by what they perceive to be a certain inconsistency there. They're not quite sure just how serious the US is about this and just how long the focus on this will remain. So thus far with regard to United States. Let me just conclude a couple of words regarding where Israel fits into all this before we can move on to our conversation. Well, from one point of view, Israel is in the kind of comfortable situation, or relatively comfortable situation, of being a neighbor to all these processes that I've been discussing, but not being a partner to them. What does that mean in practice? Ultimately, what we're talking about here with regard to Arabic-speaking world is a very, very serious existential, societal set of dilemmas. Essentially, a failure of governance to successfully develop economies, to successfully develop state borders, to successfully develop political systems, sometimes even to successfully develop a national identity, which everybody living within a particular set of borders wants to feel part of. Now, Israel, of course, is beset with very serious problems, but it's not really party to societal crisis and failure on that level, which means that the task facing Israeli policymakers in such a situation is to successfully pilot their ship, so to speak, through some pretty stormy waters. And from that point of view, I think that Israeli governance over the last decade gets, I think, some fairly good marks, in the sense that if you were to go to Israel today, you would see a country which, for all its problems, is functioning as a normal society, when just 500 or 400 kilometers up the road into Syria, you have literally active genocide being attempted, or have had that in the course of the last 5 years. So in this respect, Israel is doing not bad, so to speak. At the same time, it's not clear whether that can be infinitely sustained. The fact of the matter is that as the instability and popular uprisings of recent years begin to fade, so what we're seeing is a return to attention, so to speak, of Israel in the eyes of the Iranians and their various colleagues, with the hope that they can begin to draw Israel into that circle of resistance to American designs, which they identify as the most central task facing them and their allies in the period now opening up. Now, I could go on and on, as you can probably tell, about these subjects, but I'm actually going to stop now. We have around half an hour, a little bit more, remaining for conversation and questions, and I'm very happy to hear from everybody. One point to make before we go on to our conversation is the following. Usually at this point, the speaker or the chairperson says something like the following: but make sure you only ask a question, because we don't want to hear any speeches. On this occasion, actually, on the contrary, I'm a little bit tired of the sound of my own voice after 40 minutes. You probably are too. So if you want to actually make a comment, make a point, take issue with something I said, express fervent agreement with something I said, all those things will be, especially the last one, will be quite welcome, so that we can get straight to it. So who would like to kick off? Yes, please.
Outside of the political and the ideological, I think for the last, especially if we go back to the 70s, the problem that a lot of folk had in trying to understand this, that all of this is about oil. So to what degree has that kind of conversation shifted, and where is that now relative to the economic issue?
Mm-hmm. Oil is still vitally important. I mean, if we look at the fact that the current focus, the current center of tension in the region is the Strait of Hormuz, right? Where there's this fear of Iranian attacks on tankers, which appear to have taken place on at least 2 occasions over the last 2 months. The fear there is not some local fear that, hey, ships should be allowed to sail freely. It's real concern at the possibility that the Iranians could shut down that vital choke point through which I think it's something like 25% of the world's seaborne oil passes. And it's passing from the Persian Gulf, where the oil obviously is drilled for, out up through the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean to European markets. The fact of the matter is that oil is still a vital part of the global economy. That's changing, and many people think that in the next 20, 30, 40 years that will conclusively change. And the process of change is also driving regional events. Because if we think of the emergence of a character like Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, and his plan, which he calls Vision 2030 for Saudi Arabia, that quite revolutionary vision is intended to take Saudi Arabia from an economy based on petrochemicals to something else. But why does Mohammed bin Salman want to do that? Because he understands it's not going to be possible to have a prosperous economy based exclusively on petrochemicals 20, 30 years from now. Now, why is that? Because, of course, there are new ways. First of all, because maybe in 20, 30 years we'll have electric cars properly functioning, which will change the whole basis of the demand for oil. And secondly, because new methods of extracting oil are transforming the whole nature of the global oil economy. The fact is that the United States of America is about to become an oil exporting nation as a result of fracking and other methods of oil extraction. That changes everything. Much of the sort of groundswell in America that you hear from below saying, why do we still care about the Middle East, will make the fairly fair point, or the point that you can make, that, well, we don't need Middle Eastern oil anymore in America, so why do we need to be worrying? Why does the Fifth Fleet have to be providing security in the Persian Gulf when we don't even need that oil? Let some other country step up with its blue water navy and they can provide security. There's reasons why I think that's a wrong view, but it's a view you can make. So oil, the role of oil and the changing role of oil are still absolutely central to this equation. And especially if we sort of broaden the picture out to the global perspective, the rising power of China. I mean, China is notably a very resource-weak country when it comes to energy, when it comes to gas and oil. And China gets much of its gas and much of its oil from the Middle East, from both Saudi Arabia and also from Iran and a little bit from Iraq too. So the growing Chinese interest in the region is still absolutely underlined by the urgent need in China for affordable energy resources. So yeah, people tend to sort of say, well, it used to be oil, now it's not. Even though the nature and importance of oil is changing in the world, oil is still, and gas, are still absolutely vital to understanding the strategy and picture of the Middle East. Yes, please.
So I have a two-part question about Russia and its involvement. The first is, so you mentioned that they're driven purely by self-interest, which I think is kind of common belief on that. To my understanding, it's a purely economic self-interest rather than any sort of ideological or kind of politically driven action. So I was just wondering if you think that they could end up like supporting kind of opposing forces in the Middle East that would actually provide backlash onto them. I don't really know. I'm just kind of out there. Second is so in talking about like regional hegemony, China is definitely the biggest threat. And you just mentioned that China gets most of the oil and research from the Middle East. Do you think that Russia could branch out and stop working just for the economic motive and instead try to combat China's growth through their involvement in the Middle East?
Thanks for that. Okay, so with regard to the Russians' ideology or only economic, look, it's not only economic in the following sense. It's true that the Putin government or regime, are we allowed to call it a regime these days? It doesn't really have, of course, a coherent ideology of its own. I mean, Putin is acutely aware that nobody really wants to base their governance on the Russian model as currently understood. Right? Nobody sort of thinks, if only we could be governed the way that Putin governs Russia, then we could really begin to get somewhere. Yeah, that's a sentence that nobody ever said, right? And Putin's aware of that. So in that sense, there's an absence of ideology, except for Trump, but this I won't get into. But there is a kind of negative ideological element, which is the following. The Russians are deeply worried about Sunni Islamism. The Russians have a very considerable Muslim population over which they themselves rule, notably in the northern Caucasus. There's in a place where there's a history of popular armed opposition to Russian rule. And in those places, there is a susceptibility to Sunni political Islam. And therefore, the Russians are enemies of Sunni political Islam when they come to the region. They won't just work with anybody. They won't work with Sunni Islamists. They'll tend to be happy to work with anybody who's fighting against Sunni Islamists. They were very happy, for example, to have thousands of Sunni Islamists from the former Soviet Union come and get killed on the Syrian battlefield fighting against Bashar al-Assad. And they were happy to provide the wherewithal to Bashar al-Assad to help him with that work. Yeah. So there is an ideological element in the sense of a negative ideology, even if there isn't a positive one. There is also the element which I hinted at earlier on in the talk, or in my earlier talk, of a kind of notion of grandeur or greatness for Russia, which isn't ideological exactly in its nature, but it's something which Russians like to feel. Russians are a post-imperial people, right? Like the people in this country here in which we're currently sitting, yeah, and like the Turks. There's a certain group of peoples who are post-imperial peoples. They had an empire at one stage, they don't have one anymore, and that can often predict certain kinds of attitudes which will appeal, in the countries in question. I won't get into the whole thing of a discussion of British politics. I'm probably already walking on eggshells here, so I'll stop now, But there is that kind of outlook. The Russians have a version of that as well, which means that the Russian voter, or the Russian citizen, or the Russian subject, maybe we should call him or her today, likes to see the country doing well and being an actor on the global stage, in a way that, for example, Ukrainian citizens couldn't care less about. They don't have an expectation that Ukraine should be a global power. But Russian citizens kind of do. So one of the things that Putin is doing by his actions in the Middle East is kind of providing that picture, providing that show, so to speak, to Russian citizens in a way which I think is popular for them. So that's also an element which is not purely economic. The other thing is about Russia and China. The way it tends to work, and if you look at China's voting pattern in the UN Security Council, you can see this, is that the Chinese tend to vote with the Russians on Middle Eastern issues. In a certain sense, because the Chinese don't want to sort of dirty their hands, at least at the present stage, with active involvement in these Middle Eastern files, these Middle Eastern wars and conflicts, they tend very often to get behind what the Russians are doing. Example, with the Syrian war. The Chinese were absolutely in favor of the survival of Assad regime, were very concerned at the possibility he could lose, especially because there was quite a large component of Uyghurs who had gone over to Syria, around 3,000 people, which is not nothing, who'd gone over to Syria and were fighting with the rebels. The Chinese were very, very keen to see the rebellion be defeated, but they were happy that the Russians should do the hard work of providing weaponry and muscle and blood in order to achieve that, and they'll just stand behind with their own huge potential economic strength and watch it happen. Counterexample, but it's the same phenomenon, the Chinese are very happy to have the United States Fifth Fleet guarantee Gulf energy security. Gulf energy security is an absolutely vital need for the Chinese. But the Chinese way of thinking, at least at the present time, is not, as you might imagine a growing state might think, is not, oh, well, in that case, we've got to get our navy in there. If we need that gas and oil, we should be the ones, making sure it's safe. Right now, the Chinese don't think that way. They think quite opposite way. They're like, okay, if you want to spend your money and potentially endanger your citizens' lives by providing security for the Gulf waterways, no problem whatsoever. We'll just buy the gas and oil. Maybe 20, 30 years from now they'll think differently, but that's the way that they currently think, and that's a very notable aspect of Chinese regional behavior. Yes, please.
I had a question. So I've been sitting with a map, kind of listening to what you're saying and drawing all the lines to and from and bombs and money and all of this. And so I'm wondering, what is your opinion on the Saudization and the Saudi 2030, if it's successful or if it fails, and what impact that might have on it?
Saudi 2030 is something which we should all, I think, be watching closely and taking seriously. In other words, the idea that, well, this MBS is just another spoilt playboy, and this Vision 2030 is just his little bauble because they all have to pretend that's not accurate. The reason why it's not accurate is because of the urgency of this. The urgency of this goes back to the question about oil. was it is not going to be possible in 2030 or 2040, 2050 to have the kind of level of prosperity that the Saudis have had over the course of the last half century in an economy based purely on petrochemicals. So what MBS wants to do is he wants to try to some degree at least, transform Saudi society to some degree in order to make possible a new type of economy. And by its very nature, the kind of economy that he envisages, which will include also financial services and tourism as major sources of income, must by its very necessity be more open to the world than Saudi society has been over the last half century. And that's the sort of rubric in which you can fit such moves as allowing women to drive and all these small but nevertheless notable reforms that have taken place in the last and recent years. So for that reason, I think it is very interesting. And the thing is that the success of Saudi Arabia is important not only for them, for they themselves, but for the rest of us too. If Saudi Arabia were to collapse into chaos as a result of economic crisis, the forces that very obviously would rise to prominence in that country would be deeply worrying forces, not only for Saudi Arabia, but for all of us. That's to say, it would almost certainly and inevitably be extreme Sunni Islamist and jihadi forces that would rise up at that point if Saudi begins to totter. Because that's just what the Saudi society would probably tend to produce. It won't be secular communist revolutionaries or something, right? It'll be Islamists. And that's something very worrying. So we all have an interest in the success, I would say, of Vision 2030. There are some promising aspects to it. MBS is still very young and he's not even king yet, right? So we're going to see how it's going to work out. Maybe he won't even get to be king. You can't take that to the bank either, yeah? But yeah, I think it's generally seen as a very positive beginning, and its success is important for the continued shape of the region. Yes, at the back.
What construction do you put on the Russian arms sales to Turkey? Is that more of its interest in the region or just in a side attack on NATO?
I think it's very significant indeed, and I saw that I think just this morning or yesterday that there was an American decision, very clearly now that Turkey is no longer going to be part of the F-35 program. So the Turks have kind of made their decision. Look, I think it relates to all kinds of things. With regard to the Russians, it's just opportunism, and it's smart opportunism. It's Putin seeing a gap, so to speak, and rushing in to fill it. The fact is that you can't understand the Turkish purchase of the S-400 without understanding the Turkish interest in Syria. Erdogan was one of the very first leaders to get behind the rebellion. He got further behind it and went deeper with it than any other global or regional state. And as a result, the potential defeat and eclipse of the rebels would have been deeply humiliating for him. It would also have been deeply damaging to him. Idlib province, that rebel enclave in the northwest of Syria, it's swollen with people, right? Because people who supported the rebels from all across Syria have gone there in order to live under the authority they wish to live under. There's around 3.5 million people inside that rebel-controlled and Turkish-guaranteed province, or series of provinces in northwest Syria. If that fell, you would have almost certainly a rush by those people towards the Turkish border. At that point, one of two things would happen. Either Erdogan wouldn't let them in which case they would be massacred in their thousands by Assad's forces, and Erdogan would look to have been somebody who betrayed the people they had been supporting for the last 5 years, or Erdogan would let them in which case he would have a brand new problem of immigration at a time when the Turkish people themselves are already showing lots of signs of being very tired, even of the Syrians who already came to live in Turkey over the last 6 years. So he had to try to prevent that. Now here's the thing. The Americans and NATO couldn't help him with that, because NATO and the Americans are not present in Syria, or NATO is not there at all. The Americans are not there west of the Euphrates River, right? The Americans are present in Syria, working with their Kurdish allies east of the Euphrates. Erdogan, first of all, was annoyed with the Americans for working with the Kurds. But secondly, with regard to this rebel issue, the Americans didn't have a word west of the Euphrates. But who did have a word west of the Euphrates? Who could help him with regard to that issue? Russia could. Because Assad can't make a move. Assad can't move a finger in Syria without Russian permission. So the Russians were able to propose to the Turks a kind of agreement and rapprochement whereby they would guarantee the survival, as they are currently guaranteeing, of the rebel-controlled enclave in northwest Syria. But I assume there was also a quid pro quo for that, In other words, the Russians would say, well, you know, we'll help you with something really important to you, but in return for that, we'd also like to draw you a little bit further close to us in other areas too, such as the issue of air defense systems. So Turkey is moving towards Russia. Russia is helping Turkey, and the purchase of the S-400s forms an important element in that larger picture. Now, where can we see this stuff going? Here we get into more speculative territory, but I'm happy at least to share my own speculation with you in the following terms. You know, I tend to think that President Erdogan of Turkey may well turn out to be a historic figure. You know, he may be somebody who will be remembered to history in the way that, you know, all leaders want to be and most leaders are not. And the reason he'll be remembered, if I'm right, is because Erdogan has embarked on a historic project in Turkey. And that project is the dismantling of the Republic of Turkey as created by Kemal Atatürk 100 years ago, and its replacement by a new Turkish Republic. And this new Turkish Republic will be an Islamic Republic of Turkey. It will not be a secular republic like Mustafa Kemal's Turkey. And that's an issue of historic import. And that's important if we are right in thinking this, that's not only about Turkey, it will also dictate and define Turkey's global and regional behavior in the period now opening up. That's to say, if that is correct, the very notion of Turkey acting as kind of NATO's, you know, tip in the south against Russia is no longer relevant. That's just not part of the Turkish software anymore. That's not the way that the Turkish leadership are thinking about their country. I think that that's, I and many others think that's an accurate assessment. And if it is, my recommendation at least would be that we need to start thinking about Turkey's NATO membership and whether that's something which should necessarily, whether that's something which has any meaning and content anymore, or whether it consists of us thinking of the Turks as an ally when actually the Turks behave and are behaving as something quite different. Who had their hand up? Yes, you did, please. Afterwards, yeah.
Thank you so much for brilliant analysis and clear, very clear.
Thank you. We want more questions like this, by the way. It's just,
I'm curious because of lack of mention of EU at this point.
mm-hmm.
And if Israel's major concern is Iran, the EU seems like it's the only one left to maintain the
JCPOA, yep.
Right. So, you know, curious about your how you will respond to that.
With regard to the more broad strategic processes in the region, the Europeans are notable mainly by their absence. As the EU, you know, wanted and wants to play a role of the kind that America or Russia or other players are playing, it's never been able to do so. And the reason why it's never been able to do so, among other reasons, is because the notion of a common European foreign and security policy has always been much more of an ambition than a reality. Actually, the Europeans never really managed to develop a common foreign and security policy. France did what France did, the UK did what it did, Germany, Italy, and so on and so forth. But there's been one except there is, you're correct to point out, one exception to that, and that has been the common European continued commitment to the JCPOA. I tend to think that we're in a transitional process with this. I don't think that the Europeans, if the United States continues on its present course of seeking to squeeze the Iranians, so to speak, to try to induce them into coming back to the negotiating table, I don't think they'll come back to the negotiating table for other reasons, but I don't think it'll be the European attempt to sort of soften the impact of US sanctions, which is what the Europeans are currently busy doing, which will turn the matter. I think actually that's going to turn out to be a fairly minor problem or issue. There is, of course, this thing, Instex, this mechanism which the Europeans have supposedly created, it's not yet started to operate, which enables the Iranians to continue to trade in spite of the presence of US sanctions. But for the most part, it's not turning out to be much of a success because companies companies faced with the prospect of either trading with the Iranians or with the Americans, surprise, surprise, tend to choose the United States, and that, or facing the prospect of being excluded from the American financial system, tend to take that very seriously, even if there's supposedly some other channel whereby, no, it's no problem, you can still do it, and the Americans won't know or whatever. It's not, I think, going to work. The Iranians themselves also, by the way, are deeply impatient about this. In other words, the Iranians themselves are being deeply critical of the Europeans at the moment. They're saying, well, this is not good enough. You know, you need to either get behind us or not get behind us. And if you don't, then we being the Iranians, are going to start, as we're seeing, are going to start exiting gradually from the JCPOA. So that's the direction I think we're going in. and once again, I think what you see is that the Europeans, you know, trying very, very hard to be relevant, end up actually not being very relevant at all. You know, and if we think of such regional files as the Syrian war or the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, you know, this sounds familiar, right? The Europeans very much want to be important, and in the end, they end up not being very important at all. I suspect that with regard to Iran and JCPOA, in spite of the current moment, that's what it'll end up being. Yes, please.
How does India fit into this region?
Well, India is, I mean, as you're probably aware, India has a burgeoning economic relationship with Israel, and that goes not only for arms and military provision, but also way beyond that. Traditionally, India was, of course, a mainstay. Congress-led India, you know, in the course of the last decades, was a mainstay of the non-aligned movement, which meant that it tried not to be excessively involved in the Middle East in a practical way. In a, in a symbolic way, India tended to be very pro-Palestinian and very pro the kind of causes that the Arab world, you know, claimed to care about very much. Much of that claim to care was lip service also on the part of the Arab world, and it was lip service on the part of the Republic of India too. But that sort of world of the UN General Assembly where, you know, 5 times a week you have resolutions calling for general goodwill and usually for down with Israel as well as part of that general discourse. The Indians were kind of a part of that. They no longer are. And it's very interesting to note that the rise of Narendra Modi has sort of cast that into bold relief. It's not only about Modi. The relations between India and Israel were improving also prior to his emergence, but Modi is turning it into a kind of a very overtly declared relationship, so to speak, and that's actually having results not only in the bilateral economic relationship, which is doing very, very well anyway, but even in multilateral forums now, you're seeing some indications of a change in the Indian voting pattern, where India is no longer sort of voting automatically against Israel at the same time as trading keenly with Israel with the other hand, so to speak. With regard to elsewhere in the region, well, the Indians have workers in the Gulf. Yeah, large numbers of Indian citizens who are working in the Gulf. So that's a matter of great interest to the Indian government as well, the well-being of those people. And Indian embassies tend to take a great deal of time with that. They also have workers further afield, by the way, also in Lebanon and also in Iraq. And that's something, again, which the Indian government is concerned about. But beyond that, the Indians don't tend to have a major relationship with the smaller Arab countries. India has had a very extensive economic relationship, of course, with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And India was one of the countries which was awarded a waiver regarding the sanctions. That said, they were allowed to carry on buying Iranian oil. And of course, they no longer are. Now the Americans have cancelled all the waivers. India's put in a situation with regard to that. The Indians, of course, will obey the waiver because they have no choice, but they're not happy about it. Lastly, with regard to this, I do some work with the Indian embassy in Tel Aviv, actually, and I have some good friends there. And I was having a conversation with a quite senior Indian diplomat there just a week or so ago on this issue. And I asked him the following question. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was just in India, if you remember, a few weeks ago. And the kind of media spin that was supposed to come out of that was this notion that, like, yeah, the Indians and America are jointly threatened by the Chinese. And so Mike Pompeo was there to sort of set in motion this new alliance between India and the United States. And I asked my friend, is that for real? Is that right? Is that how you guys think about it too? And my friend's response was very interesting. He said, well, that was certainly what Pompeo came to try to sell. He said, our concern is whether the Americans are in this for the long haul. In other words, what we, in this case the Indians, are concerned about is the notion that we could sign on for something like that, annoy the Chinese a great deal as a result of it, and then find that the Americans actually aren't all that interested in sticking around to try and help us if things go bad. This is the kind of concern, the worry about the inconsistency of American policy. The other thing is that the Indians are less worried about the South China Sea. Right? They have problems with the Chinese, but the specific concerns that the US has with China are not necessarily the same ones that India has. So there's a complexity there also. Yes, please.
I appreciate your presentation, which is well crafted and great message, which just triggered my question, which is lingering. I'm here to listen and learn about anti-Semitism, which it has shed light to me, as a person who deals with the global leadership kind of courses and diversity, identity, conflict identity courses, and the role of leadership. First, my question is, what do you and anyone else help me to tell me, to help me to see what positive message I can take back to integrate to the classroom, whereby in academy, whereby it's not polarized by or characterized by crisis only. And why should a child, American child, or any other part of the world care about the crisis in the Middle East? Because to me, I don't look at one side. I look at all the sides. It's a very dark issue when it comes to Middle East. It's collapsing and imploding. And why should I have a child in North Carolina or in Canada or in Mexico or in Africa care about what's happening? And what conversation can I go and integrate in? Because you have a good view, technological view of the Middle East and the world.
Yeah.
The globalization aspect of it. Why should a child care or professor care to discuss a positive note? Because most of the time it's all crisis, people tend to back up.
Yeah, so these are kind of two questions there, sir. And I mean, the second one I find easier to answer. Why should the US care? The first one was to find some positive message. I'll get to that. It's not always easy. With regard to why should the US care, this is kind of easy to answer because we do live, of course, in a globalized world. And the point is that if the Middle East is in disarray and chaos, that is not going to stay within the boundaries of the Middle East. Now, that's an easy case to make in Europe, of course, because after all, we have actually a massive historical example over the last decade, whereby a single very big Middle Eastern crisis, the Syrian civil war, has effectively transformed European politics. Yeah, if we think about the importance of the immigrant and migration issue in European politics and whether that's led to the rise of populist and far-right parties in a number of European countries, you trace that back to the arrival of more than 1 million Syrians desperately fleeing the Syrian civil war. So with Europeans, it's obvious why they should care. But I would say that logic, even though America is further away, applies to the US too. If poisonous ideologies are taking root in large swathes of the Middle East and poisoning the minds of young people and turning them into militants who regard the West, with the US maybe chief among the West, as their cardinal enemy, that's going to have a reflection also inside America. The fact that you had the Boston bombing, the fact that you had Orlando and the rest of that long, unfortunate list is a direct result of the power of certain very toxic ideologies inside the Middle East. So the notion that one can simply draw up the drawbridge, so to speak, and just no problem, you guys get on with killing yourselves in the Middle East, we'll live happily ever after here. It's just not going to work. It's not the nature of the world that we live in. There was never a world like that. And certainly today, there's nothing like that. So this is why people should care. It's an easy point to make, and you're not required to even be optimistic by saying why people should care. They should care for their own self-interest, even if they don't care about the well-being of other people. With regard to something positive about this whole picture, look, let me be absolutely frank with you and say the following. And in this regard, I'm not making very good propaganda for the country of which I'm a citizen, and I'm also, I'm not dealing with that. But I'll be absolutely honest and say the following. Look at the blocks I was talking about and the way I was talking about the main contending players in the Middle East, so to speak. Two of those players have a very coherent vision and ideology, and those are the Iran-led regional bloc and the Sunni Islamists. Right? They are, each of those blocs, the Iran-led bloc and what we could say the Turkey-Qatar bloc, are driven forward by an idea. And it is an absolutely toxic idea, which if it triumphs will lead to disaster and to suffering for people across the region. And that's why it's important it shouldn't succeed, and I'm happy there are those of us who are organising against it. But the problem is the following. If we look at the bloc of countries, or those various countries, not really a bloc, but those various countries that are organising against these very dangerous ideas-led blocs. These countries, the opposition to that, don't really have a unifying idea, and in many ways don't really have an idea at all. And if we think about the governing systems of many of those countries, the countries with which Israel, by necessity, of course, is in alliance today, these systems don't, of course, have any answer to the existential questions facing the young populations of the Middle East. Nobody, I think, seriously believes that absolute monarchy, right, is the model which is going to successfully capture the energies of citizens across the Arabic-speaking world. But in many ways, you end up supporting absolute monarchy, you end up supporting the UAE, you end up supporting Jordan, you end up supporting Saudi Arabia, because the alternative to them is much worse. And that's an awful situation to be in. Who wants to support absolute monarchy? You know, when the apologists for Iran or these other forces get up, the strongest point they make, and it is a strong point, is, but you're standing with Saudi Arabia. How can you criticize us for our attitudes towards women or gays or towards freedom of expression when you're supporting Saudi Arabia? And it's a strong case to make. The only answer I would have to it is, yeah, it's true. We have to stop you guys because you want to bring hell on earth. And once we've stopped you, we for sure need to think about the issue of governance in Saudi Arabia and the Arabic-speaking world. There are huge and deeply problematic elements to that. So I'd like to say something positive. But the thing I can say, it will be tentative in the extreme, and it is that, sure, you can find people who believe in reform, who believe in civil society, who believe in freedoms across the region. But the fact of the matter is that in very large swathes of the region, they are extremely weak politically and militarily, which is where it often ends up in our region, and they're often squeezed between these rival forces of political and revolutionary Islam on the one hand, and reactionary systems, often absolute monarchy, on the other. I'm afraid that's just the reality, and I guess it's my job to reflect the reality as best I can. I think that's what I'm trying to do. I think we have time for probably one more question if somebody would like to ask it. Yeah, the back there. Or, I'll get to you next. Yeah, you and then you. We'll have enough time, please.
So the recent Barometer survey found that about 13% of Arab population is now non-religious, and that's a 60% increase from 5 years ago, and it's even higher among the younger generation. Do you think that would have any implications going forward?
Yeah, the answer is that I do. I'm aware of this research, and I would tend to connect it to the fact that people have now had a bit of a chance to see political Islam in power in the Arab world, which they hadn't had 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And, remarkably enough, so to speak, once people have seen Islamism in power, they tend to lose their enthusiasm for it, or at least a certain number of them do. So I do think that that's a positive development, which I followed with great interest. The problem, though, or which we need to also be aware of in this regard, is that if we were to do that research, if we were able to do similar research to that in Islamic Republic of Iran, I think we would probably find a much higher percentage of people hostile to political Islam. There they've had it in government for 40 years, and it is, I think, deeply unpopular from all the evidence I'm aware of. The problem, of course, is that political Islam does not necessarily care about governing with the consent of the governed. It's quite often happy to continue governing without the consent of the governed. So, extrapolating from opinion polls that will then extrapolate into a kind of, so to speak, 10% rise in political power, for those views is problematic. You can't always do that in the Middle East or anywhere else. But certainly I think, I'm aware of the research and I think it's significant. Yeah, I do think so. I think that's something which we see also, if I can talk about my own experience in Israel, and I live in Jerusalem in a mixed neighborhood of Arabs and Jews, and certainly there's a commonality between the younger generation on both the Israeli Jewish and, I would say, Palestinian Arab Muslim side, which is a kind of impatience with a lot of the older political ideologies and a tendency to want to focus more on the self and self-development and self-advancement rather than being involved in these old causes and old slogans. And that is something which I'm aware of. Where it will lead politically, I don't know, but it is something which is worthy of note. Yes, you had a question over there.
Yeah, I know we didn't talk about Lebanon this section, but I just had a little question about your opinion regarding Hezbollah's growth within the country and how whether or not you think their political system of confessionalism, like the sectarian-based representative political system, has played in their growth, and whether it has allowed for more, has facilitated
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think, the definitions which lie beneath that confessional system, maybe one could argue, have helped in Hizbollah's growth, just in the sense that Shia Lebanese, who of course traditionally were the losers in that system, that's to say that the level of representation that they have is lower than it should be in that system. We think an example that they get, the parliament speaker has to be a Shia, right? It's not an important position. That sort of defining the country institutionally as on a sectarian basis left Lebanese Shia, among others, with no other choice but to define themselves as Shia in a political sense. And that then did help such movements as Amal and Hizballah, who come along and say, fine, as we all know, we are required to be Shia in our political activities. We're the ones that can represent the Shia the best. And arguably, you could argue if there'd been some other version or some other definition, there might have been more ground for building an opposition to that. I'm sceptical of it, though, because as you probably are aware, and as people here should know, the traditional avenue for Lebanese Shia political activity prior to the emergence of Amal and then Hizbollah was the Communist Party. And the Communist Party was always opposed to the confessional system inside Lebanon. And yet, nevertheless, the Communist Party faded to irrelevance and Amal and Hizbollah rose. So I think at the end of the day, it's not mainly the confessional system that led to their rise. And I'll conclude by saying the following. Let's remember, with regard to Hizbollah exists within and alongside the official political system. It doesn't need to dominate it. It's quite happy to allow, the confessional system with its supposedly representative basis to continue and to say, well, Lebanon is a democracy, Lebanon has a parliament, we are one player within that. The reality, when you look closely, is that Hizbollah today enjoys uncontested power and uncontestable power within Lebanon, and that is not as a result of its conquest of the overt and legitimate mechanisms of governance in that country. It's rather by ignoring those, allowing those to continue to function, and at the same time zeroing in on the real levers of power, political, intelligence and military, which deliver real unquestionable power in that country. So I think in a certain sense, the formal political system in Lebanon is not the thing to focus on when we understand Hizbollah's power. Hizbollah's understood that's on a formal level. Real power often lies elsewhere, and they're interested in the real power, and today they've largely achieved it. I think with that happy and optimistic note, we're out of time, so thank you very much.